Well, welcome to our concluding summer lecture. It's been a wonderful summer series of lectures from guilt through grace to glory, as we've heard about the Lord's work in the lives of saints, some from the Bible and many from the pages of church history. And this morning you're in for a treat. We have Dr. David Hall with us. If you heard him in the first service, you heard a glorious sermon on predestination, one of the great foundational doctrines of our Christian religion, and was so encouraged by that. And this morning Dr. Hall will be speaking on the Calvin you never knew. Dr. Hall is one of the distinguished Calvin scholars in America today and was instrumental in organizing the Calvin 500 series that went to Geneva. Dr. Thomas spoke there, and many other names that you know very well. Dr. Hall has served as the senior pastor of the historic Midway Presbyterian Church in northwest Atlanta in Powder Springs. He's been there for 22 years. That's one of those churches, it's a glorious kind of tour de force of Reformed architecture, because you have the original sanctuary, which was, what was the original sanctuary, David, the date? 1905. Then there's the middle 20th century sanctuary, and then there's now the new sanctuary they built a few years ago that is glorious, based upon the sanctuary at Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah, Georgia. He has degrees from the University of Memphis, Covenant Seminary, and he has his PhD in Calvin's political theory from Whitefield Theological Seminary. And he writes regularly at Cheering Folly's Demise, which is a wonderful online blog full of wit and wisdom. He's married to dear Anne, and he has 3 children, one of whom is here today, Miss Devon and her family, and 9 grandchildren, and it's a delight. And before I promised I would tell you this morning in our announcements, Dr. Hall is probably one of the reasons I'm here in God's providence as your pastor this morning, because, 15 years ago, he invited me to speak at the Reformation Worship Conference, which began our relationship. And then through that, he was kind to recommend me to go to the church in Greensboro in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church that then led me eventually here as your pastor. So I owe you a great debt as a mentor and a friend. And I'm so glad to introduce you in person to our congregation this morning. Dr. Hall, please come and teach us about the Calvin we never knew. And I forgot again to invite the deacons to come up. I imagine you've already come up, man. Have you come up and taken the offering? Thank you. Dr. Hall.
Thank you, Neil and Catherine, to the elders of this church, the congregation. It's our privilege to be with you. There are in the back, by the way, if anybody's interested, there's some brochures. We host an annual worship conference. I have for years that we now alternate with the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah. And one of our keynote preachers, I don't want to take you away from your church, but one of our illustrious preachers this year is Dr. Neil Stewart. And a host of others. Terry Johnson will be there, Carl Truman, Bob Godfrey, Chad Van Dixhorn, Carlton Wynn, Carl Robbins, who I think spoke at one of these, a number of others. So if you have a free weekend in the middle of October, we would love to see you, and you're cordially invited. Mark Ross has been a regular of that work. In fact, Mark was one of our founding leaders of this Reformation and Worship Conference. So thank you for allowing us to be here. I assume you'll go to church, right? Some of you already been, some will go later, but I have such a debt of gratitude to this congregation, to this church, for the ministry you had to our daughters when they were in university. So I'll thank you more appropriately in worship. I'm going to talk about the Calvin that you don't know, because how in the world does one champion a reputation that's about as bad as possible? John Calvin, who was born in 1509, died in 1564, likely has the most malignant reputation of anyone who has made benign contributions to our world. He's been called a child hater, a pedophile, a maniacal dictator who controlled Geneva, even though he was involuntarily exiled in the year 1538. He was not a citizen there until later in his life. He was called an insensitive autocrat and many other things. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, living a little bit later, said, "What man ever was more entrenched, more imperialistic, more decisive, more convinced that his will was divinely infallible than Calvin, for whom the least opposition was always a creation of Satan, a criminal designated a firebrand." Calvin is not uniformly liked. And the question I raise with this gentle audience this morning is, how could it be that a person who was so horrible could actually fuel a movement that has lasted this long and that we still celebrate? And so I'll give you just a little bit, a brief biographical background of John Calvin, in which I want to just use under the header that this was a man who had stage fright and was in exile. That's probably part of the Calvin that you did not know. He was born in 1509. His father thought that it would be good for him to enter the ministry. Back then, the ministry was an honorable profession. Later, his father thought it would be better for him to be an attorney, so he sent him to law school, and he was converted back in Paris and wrote an early work in 1532 in which he affirmed, and this is a pithy quote, if you think anything about politics, in 1532, which is centuries before the work of Locke and Hobbes and others, Calvin wrote, "The prince is not above the laws, but the laws above the prince." That fundamental axiom changes governments. He doesn't talk about his conversion much. Calvin would never be invited to a program where the first person pronoun was used a lot. In fact, the only reference we have to his conversion, the only biographical part of his testimony, is in his commentary on the Psalms. In his introduction to the Psalms, he speaks of his desire, the desire to go and devote his life as an academic, studying and writing. He, in the time he was in Geneva, published his first volume of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is a very large volume. Don't let it discourage you. It's okay. You can read it. It's not near as hard as reading an IRS form or any kind of insurance statement, any kind of government document. It's far easier than that. With a glossary or a dictionary, you can follow it. And in that book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, he started off defending the French Protestants who were being persecuted by the Roman Catholics. He indeed was run out of Paris in 1534 as he assisted a new rector of the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, Nicolas Cop, who was elected. Dr. Cop was a Protestant sympathizer, and Calvin, most believe, helped write his rectoral address. And then he had to leave town. He wandered for a couple of years, took a number of routes, and ended up meeting a fiery pastor from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, Guillaume Farel. And Farel, as legend has it, confronted him in a mountain pass, knew of his reputation, and called John Calvin to be the pastor of Geneva, a city which had just recently broken with Roman Catholicism. They did this totally cool governmental switcheroo in Geneva, in which the citizens gathered in the year 1535 and had a vote. Now, we all take that for granted, but a vote was pretty radical at the time. And they voted to no longer be Roman Catholic, took all of the cloister buildings, all of the buildings that had been used for the Roman Catholic Church for centuries, met in the public square, voted to declare themselves Protestant. No blood was shed. The next day, the sign of the church changed. It was a Protestant church, and Geneva was the hub of the early Protestant movement. And this Frenchman, Guillaume Farel, met Calvin on a mountain pass one night and said, "If you will not come and be the pastor of this church, I will call down curses on you to curse your livelihood." And Calvin listened to that. Maybe some of you did that with Dr. Stewart. Again, if as I said earlier, if things work out well, I was happy to encourage Neil to come here and counsel with him. If it doesn't, I didn't have anything to do with that. Calvin went to Geneva and began his first residency in 1536 under the very humble title of lecturer in the Holy Scriptures at the Church of Geneva. It's a very humble title, a humble office. He was there to teach the Scriptures. He did so for 2 years. And this young man who had what I've tried to describe as stage fright, shortly thereafter was exiled. He was there for 2 years, being promised that the church would be open to his ministry, and he went sideways with most of the city fathers. And there was a particular doctrine that was at stake. The city was almost in a riotous condition, and most of the people of the church, of course, were citizens of Geneva. And Calvin said, following Scripture, I cannot officiate and offer the sacrament of the Lord's Supper because there's too much division here. To which the city council fathers said, yes, you will, young man. To which Calvin said, no, my conscience is bound. I can't do that. To which the city council said, yes, you are under our authority. You will offer communion. That's our tradition. Or else you can leave. And Calvin said, well, I can't do that in good conscience. And they showed him the door, exiled him north to Strasbourg. He spent 3 years there. And finally, in the providence of God, this exile was called back. While he was in Strasbourg, he met a widow, Idelette de Bure, whose husband was an Anabaptist pastor. She was a godly woman. They married. His 3 years in Strasbourg paid out well. He learned of a functioning school in Strasbourg. He studied the liturgy, and while he was in Strasbourg, he pastored and preached regularly to 400 or 500 people who were exiles in Strasbourg. So Calvin is this young man who has a wonderful education, a great launch for life, quickly runs up upon the shoal and is exiled. And you might ask, well, what would make a person go back? Indeed, Calvin did not want to return to Geneva. Several of his brothers in the Lord urged him to and encouraged him to. And his biographer, his first biographer, a disciple, Theodore Beza, said when Geneva had rid itself of its filth and froth, it wanted its Calvin back. And so he returned. He returned to Geneva, took up his second residency in 1541. And from 1541 until his death in 1564, he served there in very productive ways. That's some of the Calvin you didn't know, the shy reformer, the one who didn't want the limelight, who he wanted to be in libraries and devote his gifts and career to academics and to lecturing and teaching. Instead, God called him into the fires and the battles of church life. The first chapter of that didn't end well. He was exiled. He came back. He served nobly. In time, Geneva became the hub of what we know of as the Protestant Reformation in the southern part of Europe. Now let me mention a second thing about the Calvin you did not know, and I do have 5 of these. We probably won't get to those, but we'll at least use our time as we can. The Calvin you did not know was an excellent marriage counselor. Most people think of Calvin as a sort of a theological droid, as an inhumane person who had no feeling or joy, who hated women and hated children, but indeed he was an excellent marriage counselor. Marriage, to put this in context, was a new thing for the clergy in the 1530s and 1540s. We tend to forget that. Martin Luther married his Katrina in 1525. Melanchthon, another Lutheran, was married in 1520. In Germany, Martin Butzer and John Ecolampadius were married in 1531. And Calvin, who married Idelette de Bure in 1540, an Anabaptist widow, had one son conceived with her, Jacques, who died at the age of 2 weeks. So this is a man who would give marriage counseling, who understood the loss of a child. When Idelette de Bure died early, she went back to Geneva with him. He then inherited her 2 daughters to be his stepdaughters, so we could, with a little bit of a stretch, if you'll permit, speak of Calvin as a single parent, because he was in charge of raising those girls. Marriage brought about the largest institutional change of the Reformation. When you think of economics, you think of politics, you think of law, you think of education, and philosophy, a number of things. Yet most historians have said the biggest sea change in European life in the 1540s was the institution of marriage. Now, all of a sudden, your pastor was married. And that was unheard of for the Roman Catholic tradition. And when Calvin was married in 1540, and most of the Protestant reformers were, all of a sudden a new field opened up. There were new issues to discuss about family life, child rearing, and things like that began to take the center stage. And so Calvin was at the front lines of that and spoke as one who was married, who had children, who raised them, and the clergy changed. My dear wife who's here today, and I'm so thankful her, grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, Roman Catholics don't have their pastors married. And so I think Catherine Stewart asked her last night, did she know what she was getting into to be a pastor's wife? So not only did she not know what she was getting into, but there was no conception up here of being married to a pastor if one had been raised Catholic. And I do have to say, in my early years as a minister on Sunday mornings, most Sundays I would tell her, your people got this right. It's impossible to get 3 kids dressed and off to church and to think about the Lord or a sermon. So maybe the Roman Catholics had something right. Protestants realized, though, that old vow that had been taken was no longer binding, and a whole area of interest opened up. Family life took on new meaning. Calvin and the other Protestant reformers wrote on many issues of family life. These became commonplaces. You can look, and I'll just give you a couple of references. You can look at the first couple of chapters of Genesis in Calvin's commentaries, or Genesis chapter 17, to see some of the things that he says about marriage. And it's important to see that he understands marriage begins as an institution of God. It was a divine institution, not one merely of social contract. And Calvin has some very insightful comments in his commentary on Genesis chapter 1. So sort of think of the layers of Calvinistic literature. If I could simplify in this way, most people know of his Institutes of the Christian Religion, a volume that's about 1,200 pages in English translation. That's only one strata of information about Calvin. He also wrote a series of commentaries that numbered 44 volumes. In most commentaries today, they're put together, but each of these are about 500 pages in a 22-volume set. So there's the Institutes, there are Calvin's commentaries. Your pastor will search around, and if he quotes Calvin on Proverbs sometime, know that he made that up, because that's one of the few books that Calvin did not offer a commentary on. He also steered clear of the Song of Solomon for pretty obvious reasons. The third layer of Calvinistic literature are his sermons. There were hundreds of sermons, some of which have only been translated in my lifetime, translated in English, that is. And that's another very interesting layer of Calvinistic thought. That's what I'm going to share with you mainly in the topic of Calvin as marriage counselor. And then fourthly, there were a number of tracts and individual theological monographs. So there's a wide body of literature. A lot of people tire themselves out studying the Institutes. Maybe they get to the commentaries, which are good for most pastors. But Calvin's sermons are rich. They're very good. And I want to tell you about the Calvin you don't know. I want to read you some quotes from Calvin's sermons on Ephesians chapter 5, which is a great passage. And I have to say, I'm still a little bit shocked when I read these, because these go so squarely against the reputation of what Calvin is. In Ephesians chapter 5:22, Calvin says, "Wives should be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. Each of us covets to be above his fellows, and since we set so much store by the loftiness that it is hard for us to stoop, and yet love binds us to others." When a wife, Calvin wrote, is joined to her husband, she becomes part of his body. For she is his companion, listen to these, both to live and to die. If we despise the order of God, Calvin the marriage counselor wrote, we make war against God. And in so doing, she sets herself against the majesty of God. And Calvin goes on and he talks about that relationship in which wives are called to be submissive to their husbands and to respect them. And the husband is called to love his wife, to lay his life down for his wife, and to present her as a radiant bride to Christ. And we, again, tend to think that Calvin was this horrible person who was persistently grumpy, never smiled, didn't know anything about love or ordinary affection. But on Ephesians chapter 5, Calvin says, since our Lord Jesus presides over marriage, isn't that a great phrase? He presides over marriage, then men must have an eye to him, and every person submit himself patiently, seeing that no person can refuse his part without despising him who will have a marriage maintained. If a wife contends with her husband, it is just as if they were to reject God. Those are pretty strong words, but they're carrying words, and it's very balanced. Calvin goes on in Ephesians chapter 5 to give a pithy summary when he says, every man who does not love his wife is a monster. Talk about fairness, talk about interpreting the scripture correctly. Calvin certainly did that. And he says in Colossians chapter 3 that if husbands are not loving their wives, they abuse the authority of God by way of tyranny. Calvin says we can really love those whom we esteem, but love must be connected with respect. In any event, I just want you to know that Calvin was a pastor. He was well-grounded. He was rounded. He dealt with difficult issues. And one of those sets of issues he dealt with were with broken homes, with poor, and with refugees. I'll get to that part in just a minute. So first of all, the Calvin you didn't know was a shy person with stage fright who became an exile. Secondly, he was one who gave good counsel and biblical counsel on the institution of marriage. Thirdly, I want you to know about Calvin the printer. Publishing the faith is a very important part of what we do. While Calvin was in Geneva, Bibles began to fly off of Genevan presses. And perhaps the largest single printing venture of the 16th century was Beza, Calvin's lieutenant, Beza's French translation of the Psalms into metrical form, which was printed in Geneva's old town. That Huguenot Psalter became the revival book, songbook of expansionistic or missionary Calvinism. Calvinism spread, and the Huguenots, or the French Protestants, would dislodge many of the minds of their peers by singing those songs and by printing the sermons of Calvin. And the ability to defend the views of this new thought, of this Calvinism, began to be magnified by the revolution in print from the Gutenberg press, which Martin Luther seized with excellence. But in Calvin's time, a printing industry began. This was a broadcast hub for Southern Europe. And when Calvin first arrived in Geneva, there were 3 books a year printed. 1536, 3 books. By 1554, there were 28 a year. And by 1561, 48 separate volumes were printed in Geneva. Approximately 200 refugee printers settled in Geneva during Calvin's lifetime, and by 1563 there were at least 34 different presses in this small town of Geneva. A mere 5 years later, one of Calvin's contemporaries wrote, "The printed works flooding into the country could not be stopped by legal prohibitions. The more edicts issued by the courts, the more the booklets and papers increased." So the French in the neighboring country next door, just to the north and west of Switzerland, outlawed books that were printed in Geneva. The Edict of Chateaubriand in 1551 made it illegal to print, distribute, or sell books that were printed in Geneva. So threatening were these ideas and the publication of them to the Roman Catholic Church and monarchy in France that they outlawed these books. Well, what's a good committed Calvinist to do? You find a couple of loopholes. So what Calvin and his presses began to do was they began to print very small books that you could put in your clothing. And you could carry those instead of what one said, the old Bibles were almost like full-size volumes chained to Stonehenge. They were so large. You could be caught with that. So Calvin and his printing industry began to print small books. The other thing they did that's to me just beautiful in its cunning, it's sort of like the Israeli plan that took many years to hack all of those pagers. Whether you like Israel or not is not my issue, but I just think that's an ingenious military tactic. Calvin and his printers, shrewd as they were, when they faced this edict which had outlawed the printing of books made in Geneva, printed to go around the edict of Chateaubriand, printed books that had fake addresses on the title pages, printed in France, and used fonts that were used only in France, and continued their printing work. So that's part of the Calvin that you probably didn't know. Next, I want you to know about Calvin, the philanthropist. He was a very generous, caring man. A study of Calvin and welfare in Geneva is well worth your time. There were some 60,000 refugees who came to Geneva during the decade of the 1550s. Many of these came up from northern Italy, some of the very affluent families, most of the refugees and immigrants who were moving to Geneva because it was a place of safety and an oasis for the Reformed movement. Usually had means. Some of them were of the nobility. They had crafts, they were printers, they were jewelers, they were bankers, and yet to overwhelm that small city with 60,000 refugees led to a logistical challenge that's not small. What did Calvin and the church do? Calvin and the church, studying the scriptures, particularly the book of Acts and the pastoral epistles, said we must have a diaconate. And they established the diaconate in their time and chartered it with a number of proofs and strengths. And Calvin himself was so interested in seeing the diaconate flourish that he not only left an inheritance for his family when he died, a small one, but in his will provided for the boys' school in Geneva and for poor strangers. This social institution called the Bourse Français, if you will, the marketplace, the organized market of French-speaking Switzerland, organized the diaconate, which was new for most of the Protestant Reformation. Prior to that, the Roman Catholic Church encouraged and rewarded almsgiving. But when you have social strains and stresses like this, the church stood up. And Calvin led the church sometime in the years between 1536 and 1541, exclusive, by the way, of his 3 years exile in Strasbourg. During that window, when Calvin comes back in 1541, the diaconate is organized and was called on to do a lot of things. They provided interim subsidy. They provided job training as necessary. This is a very progressive organization. They even provided the necessary tools and supplies so that able-bodied persons could work in honest vocations. They were even discriminating as they ascertained the difference between the truly needy as opposed to those who were simply indigent. And if necessary, they would also suspend subsidy. The diaconate in Calvin's church also created hospitals. The beginning of the hospital movement has in many ways its roots in Geneva during Calvin's time, and doctors were given the opportunity, as living out their Christianity to take care of those with bodily ills, and yet the deacons always oversaw the medical conditions and needs that were there. Calvin, in fact, had his diaconate organized into two different classifications. There were the deacons, as you sort of think of regular deacons, and then there were the hospitallers, whose sole function was to care for the sick and the needy. And so the church lived out the fullness of this calling and modeled itself on the New Testament. Let me read to you a summary of principles from the diaconate welfare, the care for the poor, from the Calvin you did not know. In summary, these were principles of the Reformation welfare reform. First, it was only for the truly disadvantaged. Secondly, moral prerequisites accompanied assistance. There were requirements. Thirdly, private or religious charity, not the state largesse, was the vehicle for aid. Fourthly, ordained officers managed and brought accountability. Fifth, theological underpinnings were normal for this ministry to the poor. And sixth, the productive work ethic was sought and assistance was temporary. Calvin said in one place in one of his sermons on 1 Timothy chapter 3, I'll give you a short quote. If we want to be considered Christians and want it to be believed that there is some church among us, this organization of the deacons must be demonstrated and maintained. Calvin thought the diaconate was so important that it was at the essence, at the heart of the Christian church, the Christian faith. Later, commenting on another passage, Calvin, whose name is not always immediately identified with compassionate advocacy for welfare to the poor, asserted, "Do we wish to show that there is reformation among us? We must begin at this point, that there must be pastors who bear purely the doctrine of salvation, and then deacons who love the care of the poor." That was Calvin's heart for the poor. Let me move on to one other very important point, or data point of the information of the Calvin you do not know. Perhaps some of you do. Calvin was the political godfather of most of the Western democracies. He wrote, as I mentioned, a commentary on most books of the Bible. And in those commentaries and in his volumes of sermons, Calvin, you might be interested to know, had such a relationship of diplomacy that he dedicated his commentaries to over a dozen kings or governors or dukes. Now, you might say, well, he was aspirational in his book dedication, but it also is probably an accurate display that he interacted with these civil leaders and knew them well and admired them. His Catholic epistles commentary was dedicated to Edward VI, King of England. His 1 Timothy commentary was also dedicated to the Edward the Duke of Somerset. He dedicated volumes to King Gustav of Sweden, the Council of Frankfurt, and many others. So his interactions were drawn on because this was a man who, again, in 1532, as a very young scholar, began to say, the prince is not above the laws, but the laws are above the prince. I would commend to you at least two passages of Calvin's work if you want to see more about his political thinking. The first of those is his commentary, or a sermon actually, on 1 Samuel chapter 8. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, one of those addresses, by the way, which is drawn on as much as anything in political thought, he gave a discussion in 1561 in which he warned against a monarch who would have too much centralized control. He says instead a prince is to work, and listen to his words taken up 2 centuries later in American literature, they are to work for the common good, commonwealth, and to govern and direct the people in truest fairness and justice. Calvin calls for the governor to use his office to further the good of the people, not for his own ends. The second passage for you to know is Exodus chapter 18. The Republican form of government was first suggested in Scripture by Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. And in that chapter in which Jethro comes to Moses and says, no, Moses, you're taking all of this on yourself. You're trying to do too much. What you need we need organization of those who will be leaders with you, over 50 and 100 and 1,000. And only the toughest cases arise to your attention and dominate your time. And in that pristine example of federalism, which many people drew on in the Middle Ages, for example, Machiavelli even, Thomas Aquinas, and others drew on this. Calvin, in his sermon on Deuteronomy chapter 1, in the 1560s, said these words, and listen to how strikingly modern they are. Indeed, I would say they are in advance of most Republican institutions in the West. If you ask the chicken and egg question, in other words, which came first, Calvin's thought or John Locke's thought, Calvin's thought came 100 years, a full century before Locke. He said on Deuteronomy chapter 1, hence it more plainly appears that those who were to preside in judgment were not appointed only by the will of Moses, but elected by the votes of the people. That's an absolutely radical statement for 1562. To say that in a world that is totally monarchical. There's no such thing as Americans. We take all of our civic institutions for granted. They did have a point of origin. And if you go back and trace many of these, you'll find much of their origin going back to Geneva. Calvin continued in that sermon to say this is the most desirable kind of liberty, where people vote, where people have the franchise. But he says, rather than a tyranny, what we should have is one that allows for elections so that no one should rule except he be approved by us. There's the consent of the governed in the early 1560s in Geneva. 2 full centuries before that is articulated in our country. One of the procedural safeguards of the civic reforms in Geneva and a benchmark of Calvinistic governing was that there would be various branches of local government, various councils. There were 3 separate councils in Geneva. By design, their government became very unwieldy. It was very sluggish because they wanted to have checks and balances. And predating the work of Montesquieu, a separation of powers doctrine came about in Geneva almost 2 centuries before the founding of the American Republic. Now, let me do a little experiment. I'm almost through. You've been very patient. Thank you for listening. But let me do just a little experiment with you. I should have this printed out for you, and I can give these notes to your pastor if you wish. But in a sermon on the book of Galatians, I want to read you just a gloss, a short sentence or two by Calvin on Galatians, in which he said, and he died in 1564, so if you want a marker, this is prior to that. Calvin wrote in a sermon on Galatians, if we were all like angels, blameless and freely able to exercise perfect self-control, we would not need rules or regulations. Why then do we have so many laws and statutes? Because of man's wickedness, for he's constantly overflowing with evil. That is why a remedy is required. In sum, you see what Calvin says? Why do we have government? It's because of the fall, and because we're wicked, and because by claw, by hook, whatever it takes, citizens will try to get their way and hurt others. Government itself, Calvin says, is necessary because of the theological doctrine of depravity. Because if we were all angels, no government would be necessary. Fly forward in your time machine over 200 years later to open up a pamphlet written by American James Madison, and the Federalist, number 51. Madison said, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls or government would be necessary. And that's hard to overlook, the linguistic similarity. Over 200 years later, that had become a commonplace notion in the development of Western governments. And another preacher in 1784 gave this great stirring sermon to the New Hampshire legislature, in which he said, if mankind were in a state of rectitude, there would be no need of the sanctions of human laws. It's really difficult to ignore the ideological connection between Calvin's commentary on a sermon on Galatians, which is picked up almost verbatim by Madison and by others in the Federalist paper. Well, I'm just going to end by giving you a short summary of my fifth and last point, which I won't develop because of time. But Calvin was a friend. There was a circle of friends. No movement really can continue to be fueled without a school of thought or with a circle of friends. Calvin was not an individual. He attracted great talent to Geneva. He attracted the talent of the printers. He attracted the Italian nobility. Wealthy bankers came to Geneva from families that are still there today who would not identify in the least with John Calvin or Calvinism. He attracted a number of other professions. He attracted great educators. They started schools and seminaries, and so Geneva became what was called the Protestant Rome. It was a turbine that brought people in, sent them back. John Knox, for example, among them, was a refugee harboring in Geneva until he could return to Scotland. And Calvin was known as a friend. It is impossible to have a movement like this if you have a lone dictator. You simply cannot, and I'll say this before closing with one quote, you simply cannot create, sustain, and fuel a movement that is run dictatorially by an evil personality. And so it remains for people still to describe and define why it was Calvin was so successful. When he died in 1564, the Genevan councils and senators came and they mourned him. They mourned his loss. And I want to read to you in closing just a few of his closing words from his farewell address. Calvin said, "When I first came to this church, there was almost nothing. We preached, and that was all. We searched out idols and burned them, but there was no reformation. Everything was in tumult. I lived here through marvelous battles. I was welcomed with mockery one evening in front of my door by 50 or 60 rifle shots. Do you think that could disturb a poor, timid student as I am? I confess so." He humbly then continued to confess on his deathbed, "I say again that all that I did has no value and that I am a miserable creature. But if I could say what I truly wanted to, that my vices always displeased me, and that the root of the fear of God was in my heart, and you can say that what I was subjected to was good, and I pray that you would forgive me of the bad, but if there's anything good, that you would confirm yourselves in it and to follow it." And Calvin passed away after that address. The whole state regretted the death of its wisest citizen, a common parent, a biographer said. He was interred in a common cemetery in Plain Palais, finally finding the anonymity that he craved. That one historian wrote was characteristic of Calvin in life and death, and the widespread notice and sadness of his death should serve to correct any faulty view that his contemporaries either despised him or underestimated his importance. He was mourned, and his large number of friends would keep his memory alive far more than the contemporaries would have predicted. This leader's successes were recognized and celebrated by others. You would not have Calvinism without a Calvin, who was this unknown figure, one who was sensitive to the needs of family life and gave good marriage counseling, one who was a printer involved industriously in spreading the faith, one who was a philanthropist par excellence, who established welfare models for his state, and one who was a political godfather for many nations, and one who was a friend who loved those around him and worked consistently. This, I hope, is some of the Calvin you did not know. Thank you.